So in previous classes, we've spoken about the challenges or say, a classical high point of the Ottoman Empire under the reign of Suleiman. This isn't a real high point. It's just a way that people back in the 16th century and 17th century started thinking about Ottoman history and identifying the reign of Suleiman as the sort of perfect period against which they then judged future moments. Now, there were a set of challenges, a set of major institutional transformations that started occurring in the late 16th century, or the 18th century, 1580s, continued basically throughout the 17th century until the 1680s. We're going to talk about those. And part of them are spurred by environmental changes, in particular, the Little Ice Age. And we're going to speak about the role between environment and Ottoman history in this period and how to think about the role of the environment. Some of you may remember, and you should know, that in Syria, there is still an ongoing civil war. It has not been fully resolved. We're not going to watch this explainer, but there is a multi-pronged civil war that started in 2011 and continues to some degree to this day, even though it's stabilized as the Syrian government has viciously and brutally put down most of the rebellion. At the same time, there's also a group called ISIS that took power independently in northwestern Syria, northeastern Syria. And that also spurred various international groups to engage in Syria in different ways beyond their support or lack thereof of the Syrian government. One question to think about is, what was the role of the environment in the Syrian civil war? There's two articles that were published about 4 or 5 years into the war that thought about the space of climate in it. One is this article that was published in PNAS. I don't know what even that acronym stands for. And then there was a variety of popular responses to it, including this article in The Guardian. The article in the academic journal argued ultimately that one of the reasons that spurred the Syrian civil war was a set of droughts, a continued decrease in rainfall in the Middle East, and it specifically harmed areas that were reliant on marginal rain-fed farming. So in the lead up to in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was increased cultivation of northeastern Iraq, which is basically a deserty area. At the same time, we see a overall decrease in rainfall over this period, while an increase in population. At the same time, the collapse of rainfall ultimately led to people abandoning those farming areas and moving into cities, where they helped spur the rebellion in conditions of poor government. And Syria has always been relatively poorly governed by an autocratic regime. Now, in response to that argument, scholars have pointed out different motives for the Syrian civil war. One, they argue that the displacement from the drought was not as high as reported, ultimately, that it was 250,000 versus 101,500,000. So it was actually much smaller than people thought. And the migration was not actually linked to rainfall. It was rather linked to cancellation of fuel and fertilizer subsidies in 2009, as the Syrian government came under increased economic pressure. And ultimately, it wasn't the migrants themselves who were responsible for the Syrian civil war. They were not the people that were protesting necessarily. We can't assume just because you have groups of unemployed rural migrants that they're necessarily the people involved in protests and then ultimately in civil war. And these articles argue that the environmental narrative is not one that is actually useful, but is actually just one pushed by military think tanks that are using this idea or example to, let's say, ignore the effects of bad government and autocracy on this. And in fact, the ultimate actions of the civil war is caused by the Syrian government. It's the Syrian government who cracked down on peaceful protests in 2011 and turned those protests into an armed insurrection, whereas it could have actually dealt with them in a different way. So one thing to think about is, what is the role of the environment in the civil war in Syria? And ultimately, this is a question about how do we think about human agency. So we have things like governments. The president of Syria has agency. He makes actions. He decides to crack down on protests or cut fertilizer subsidies, etc. But the environment doesn't have the same agency that a human does. And in fact, it's very hard to clearly tie together climatic changes or environmental changes to things like human action. One way to think about it is, again, to look at one of the podcasts that you have to listen to, which is one by Alain Michael about the possible effects of a volcano in Iceland on the population of Egypt in the 18th century. That volcano was in 1783, the Laki volcano. It was such a massive volcano that it led to essentially extended winters and collapse of agriculture in Iceland. Certain types of mice and animals basically went extinct. And as he pointed out, 75% of its horses, 80% of the sheep, and 50% of the cattle died on the island. So it was a massive famine and transformation. Now, what he was looking at was not necessarily the effects on Iceland, but what was the effects of the ash cloud on weather in Cairo, into the Middle East. He argues that it basically transformed the amount of sulfur dioxide, which changed the monsoon in the Indian Ocean. This changed the rainfall levels at the source of the Nile in Ethiopia. The Nile flood was reduced by 25% for a number of years. This created extreme problems on a society that was dependent on the Nile flood for its agricultural production. And in the process, strongmen were able to essentially seize estates that were in debt, smaller estates, and create larger agricultural holdings, which ultimately led them to consolidate power and supported political rebellion in Egypt over the next few decades. So in this case, we have events that independently can occur from each other, but we might think of it as a tilted playing field, right? So climate transformations in climate, whether short-term or long-term, ultimately make some types of actions and possibilities more likely than others, even if they don't fully explain it. So if we can think of an ideal climate or a normal climate like this, changes in climate might shift slightly the tilting, making certain types of possibilities more likely than others. And this is one of the questions that we have when we're thinking about Ottoman history in the kind of 1580 to 1640 period. And during this time, there was a set of revolts, sort of uncoordinated rural revolts that were not even revolts, they're essentially extreme banditry, led by sometimes rebels, sometimes just opportunistic robbers, that happened mostly in Anatolia and northern Syria. They were called the Jalali revolts. This is a sort of a generic name for them. It was started off initially by someone, one of them was led by someone called Jalal, and therefore it took on this name. But it was a phenomenon that kept occurring. There was constant rural banditry and attacks on villages during this period from 1580 to 1640, and it took a long time for them to be put down. Now, who were the bandits? Who were these rebels? They were essentially different people, local discontents, people that had been lost farmland, who didn't have any other means of sustaining themselves. There was irregular troops, as we'll see, people that had fought in the Ottoman army, but were just hired temporarily. They had access to cheap firearms, which were increasingly available through the army, and then were able to then bring those back and use them in their attacks. And there was also some unemployed students who, unable to find jobs after studying, decided to join these rebels. So these groups were quite vicious. They attacked all sorts of towns and villages, both Muslim and Christians. Throughout Anatolia, they basically came in, attacked everyone, killed people often, stole whatever they could, and then fled. And it took a while, a long amount of confrontation, co-option, and different transformations for the Ottoman government to put these people down. Now, to explain the process of the Jalali revolts, there's two different types of explanations. One is essentially a social explanation, and this you can see in the work of Oktay Özel. He kind of sets out a set of social, political, and political explanations starting in 1500 and leading into the 1600s. So in terms of social, he's talking about economic and demographic growth. This 1500s were a period of massive demographic growth, actually throughout the globe, but also in the Ottoman Empire. The population essentially doubled. One, because of, in general, peace in the Ottoman Empire after kind of centuries of various forms of warfare, but also there were favorable climatic conditions. And this surplus population led to questions of, well, how do you divide land? Do people expand farming or not? Some people were able to then become educated in different ways. But ultimately it became a demographic crisis in the 1600s because there just wasn't enough food and land for people to cultivate. This led to transformations in settlement. People might have settled on poorer land, moved into different areas. Peasantry might have tended to migrate to other places, etc., or go into the military looking for different work. The other thing he points to is kind of militarization of the countryside through the spread of firearms. Partially, this is just by fighting local rebellions, but also the fact that irregular troops were increasingly used in the Ottoman army to fight its battles, which were centered not on cavalry, but on infantry troops with guns. Those troops then brought those guns back to Anatolia and then used them in the process of rebellion. And then he also points to kind of political problems, questions of political exclusion of these groups and how they were ultimately not allowed into the ruling elite in any ways. There was a kind of invisible wall or glass, very clear glass wall, separating people from, let's say, the ability to enter and take part of state processes. All of this led to the Jalali phenomenon, which led to both banditry and other forms of military organization in the countryside. Each of these also led to different transformations in taxation, in administration, etc., which we'll get into. So other people, for example, Sam White, provides a different explanation. He sees the initial start of this as a very long drought that lasted for 6 years in 1591 and 1596. This is the worst drought in the Mediterranean. And this starts off a negative feedback loop. So in the 16th century, during this period of massive demographic expansion, you have a virtuous cycle, right, in which each of these feeds into creating increased population stability. So you have population growth, which expands farming as people farm more areas, tear down forests or steppe to farm more. As farming becomes easier and villages become more well defended, etc., nomads find themselves moving towards farming and settling down rather than attacking agriculturalists. As nomads stop attacking people, you have more rural security, which makes it easier to farm and makes it easier for the population to grow, etc. All of these are part of the virtuous cycle that allows things to function. But starting with the sets of droughts and then continued during this little, what's called the Little Ice Age in the 17th century, you get a vicious cycle in which you have decreased production of subsistence foods. The population is declining because they're starving. Again, you have 1 or 2 years of leeway, and then it's people start abandoning land, starving to death, or reverting to pastoralism or banditry to do it. Now, people become nomads again. They start attacking villages, or they become bandits and they start attacking villages. The lack of security leads to migration to urban centers. And there was a massive migration of villagers from Anatolia to larger cities in Western Anatolia, places like Istanbul or Izmir or Thessaloniki, which eventually leads to more population decline, which leads to decreased production of food. As villages are abandoned, people move into the mountains for security. This leads to increased erosion, as the erosion leads to the creation of swamps, which leads to malaria becoming endemic in many areas, which further decreases the population and the health of the people. And people, again, move away from the countryside towards urban centers. So it's hard to break out of this situation. So all of this is exacerbated by the Little Ice Age, which is we'll see is a minor decrease in temperature, which ultimately led less than 1 degree Celsius, but led to the deaths of a large percentage, perhaps 20% of the human population in the 17th century. So here again, we have climatic events, either drought or increased snows, leading to harvest failure, death of livestock. Peasants abandon land, they're malnourished, and as they abandon land, there's breakdown of public orders, people revert to banditry, people flee from the cities, which leads to a set of similar problems. So we have all sorts of death, drop in fertility, deaths by starvation, deaths by infections, death by epidemics, and also death from cold. So it's a massive destruction of the population in the 17th century. So both of these, in a sense, come together. The question is, how does the social and the environmental interact? And how do we even find out what the climate in the past was? Today, we could take ice cores, or we can look at temperature readings, et cetera. But we don't have that information really before the 1900s. And in other places, we don't have it regularly, even into the 1900s. So we do know, for example, that there are moments of extreme cold. So in 1954, the Bosphorus froze completely over. And in fact, we'll see this happened during the 17th century in different times. So how do we find out information about events like that? Can we understand climate in the past? There's a whole variety of sources for historical climate data. Each of them has its own benefits and frailties. So we can look at ice cores, pollen samples, tree rings, stalactites, narrative sources, pictorial representations, archaeological evidence, and some instrument data that is, measuring temperature. We know, for example, just from pictorial representations, that an entire landscape genre of winter scene developed in Holland to depict the types of winters that were occurring during the 17th century. But more scientifically, or at least quantitatively, the best data comes from ice cores, in which you can see the types of gases that were circulating regionally in this period. Each slice of an ice core, which is kind of sliced by laser and then analyzed for the gases that were trapped in the air at the time, can tell us what was going on. The problem with ice cores is that they are in just a few locations. So there's one for Europe over here in the Alps of Italy. There's some in the Himalayas and Greenland, one in the Rockies and some in the Andes. But otherwise, you don't really have many ice cores. Antarctica is a space of many ice cores, but Antarctica shows the atmosphere composition for the whole world, whereas if you want local information, you have to go more locally. So in the Middle East, we don't have any ice cores. We have ice cores for Europe, and often Middle Eastern climatic data is extrapolated or assumed to be the same as European, but we don't really have that. Now, the other thing you can do is look at tree rings. Again, tree rings only exist in places with lots of trees. If I remember, this should be tree rings. Failing to have tree rings, though, you can also use in tropical places coral. Coral functions in many of the same way. And so between all those, ice cores, tree rings, and corals, you can get a sense of what was climate and temperature like, and specifically what was the atmosphere like. And from that, we can tell that there was something called a Little Ice Age, in which temperatures were slightly below, as you can see in the Little Ice Age, less than 1 degree Celsius. By the way, climate change is going to transform, increase the global temperature by at least 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Little Ice Age, as you can see here, over the course of 1600, 1700, saw the majority of years colder than normal. This is partially due to transformations in sunspot activity and volcanic activity. But the real question is, what was the effect of this Little Ice Age on human populations? Overall, we see a decrease in food production, a decrease, obviously, in population, smaller humans, and an increase in rebellion and banditry. So let's start with the rebellion and banditry. In a book called Global Crisis by Jeffrey Parker, he kind of puts together all these different rebellions that occurred around the 1600s. Now, whether or not these are tied to climate is obviously not clear, but it is clear that there is actually a number of massive revolts, revolutions, essentially, moments in which the entire government is overthrown or transformed. So, for example, in England, they essentially kill their king and put in a completely different system in for a while, and then overthrow that again. That's the Restoration and the English Revolution. In China, the Ming Dynasty collapses and the Qing Dynasty comes in. All these different visions of different fights and revolts are occurring. Now, when you put them all like this, it seems like they're occurring consistently, but maybe the same thing could be said in the 1500s. It's hard to kind of quantitatively understand this information, but Jeffrey Parker is trying to connect global rebellion to forms of climate transformation. And it does seem that quite around different parts of the world, you see this sort of continuous rebellion. One of the interesting things is that probably the most stable environmental and politically places at this time is Japan, which doesn't have massive rebellions. It doesn't have population decline. So the Ottoman Empire, interestingly, also has massive rebellions. Some of those rebellions are in Istanbul, but a lot of them are also rural rebellions, the Jalali revolts between 1580 to 1640, which led to the massive depopulation of the Anatolian and Syrian countryside. At the same time, we have rebellions in Istanbul right around the start of the Little Ice Age, smaller rebellions by different troops between 1590 and 1603. Now, this becomes bigger between 1622 and 1703. Not only do we have little rebellions, but we have 6 sultans deposed, and they're deposed by their own troops, by the Janissaries. So at this point, we have a few of those sultans are actually killed by their troops. Some are just overthrown and replaced. We'll talk about why that is and how to understand it. But I want to point out that there does seem to be some sort of connection, at least between political stability and environmental factors. Though, as we'll see, also social factors can easily explain this as well. The same processes we can also see of demographic growth applied, as I mentioned, to Anatolia. So the population of the empire grew 150% during the 16th century. Partially it was because new lands and new peoples were being incorporated, but also there was just absolute growth. There was just more people being born and surviving. And we can see this just if you look at the population estimates between 1520s and 1580s. So all sorts of parts of Anatolia had massive population increase. And this is true in large parts of the world. You can see actually a big jump of population in the 16th century. And you can see a major slowdown in the 1600s in many places. And if you were to look, for example, in estimates of world population, 1600 and 1700, China's population falls, India's population grows, but Europe doesn't move very much. Latin America collapsed between 1500 and 1600. That's because of the conquest of the Americas and the impact of bacteria and viruses on that population. But overall, we see different transformations in population at this time. One of the things, the impacts of the Little Ice Age also changed is that humans ended up getting smaller. This is just based off of French males born to 1650 to 1770. So during the 1600s, we see that French males conscripted into the army were on average, let's say between 1 meter and 62 centimeters. That's pretty short. That's like 5'3", 5'2" or something. That's the average. So you basically have humans that are just smaller. Humans that are smaller have to work harder to achieve the same amount physically. So when they're farming or doing other artisanal activities. And we can see how this goes up in the 1700s as the climate gets better. So we can also pull together different qualitative statements about the weather. Different people from all over the world, from China to India, talk about how bad the famine is or how harsh the winters were. And this continues in different ways, and we can tie this together into a political transformation. So Jeffrey Parker speaks about a dark synergy between climate and politics, in which the impact of the Little Ice Age ultimately led to rural instability, which leads to urban instability, and spurs a state of rebellions, both small, between 15 and 1603, and then ultimately 2 regicides and 4 other depositions of Ottoman sultans in the 17th century. Now, as I pointed out, it's hard to point directly to an environmental cause of these depositions. It's much easier to talk about social transformations. But I think we have to take at least the idea that the environment impacted the stability of the Ottoman Empire. And what's more impressive is that over the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire managed to survive and adapt, but it had to change its core institutions to do so. And we're going to look at what that involved in the next lessons. One of the things I want to point out is that the very first regicide in 1622 was of a sultan called Osman II, or Genç Osman. He was called Genç because it means young, because he was very young when he came to power. I think he was 14 or so. And you can see this because he doesn't have a beard, so he's not seen as an adult in the sense. He lasted for about 4 years until his troops essentially completely rebelled against him, stormed into the harem, deposed him, and then eventually had him strangled, because you're not supposed to spill the blood of a sultan. So they choked him, I think, with a rope or a cloth. One point to keep in mind is the fact that the Bosphorus froze over for 40 days in 1621. This is a very rare event, something that happens probably every few hundred years. But it happened pretty often during the 17th century. It happened, as we noticed, in 1621 and the next year, Osman II was killed. Is this part of the dark synergy that impacted Ottoman politics? We'll find out, hopefully, in future lessons. Stay tuned.